Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad. I will be co hosting this event along with Mariam Durrani. Today, we are very pleased and honored to have with us three remarkable scholars, Maya Wind, Shahrazad Odeh, and Sara Ihmoud, who will be addressing the fourth installment of In Defense of Academic Freedom, the case of Israel and Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. It's part of the series that we started a few weeks ago, and we are very happy to keep going as much as we don't like to hold this series because it reflects the intimidation, suspension, and all sorts of infringements on academic freedom that we are witnessing in the United States and Israel and potential and quite beyond actually. Today, we will be addressing this particular topic based on the idea that severe limitations in Israel on academic freedom for Palestinian scholars is taking place in Israeli universities, and it's directly tied to the wider project of targeting Palestinian education. We address the Israeli Academy's repression of Palestinian critical research and pedagogy in light of the arrest of Hebrew University professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian and the power of Palestinian feminist anti-colonial writing and teaching to bring true academic freedom for all. We also will discuss, or Maya, specifically Maya Wind, will discuss her fantastic book, Towers of Ivory and Steel, How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom. She will be discussing this in the process. The person who will lead this conversation is Mariam Durrani, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. Let me just say that this is also part of the broader project of Gaza and Context, as well as the DC, Maryland, and Virginia Faculty for Academic Freedom, and is co sponsored by a large number of organizations, including the MESA Task Force on Civil and Human Rights, MESA's Committee on Academic Freedom, and the Faculty for Justice in Palestine Network, which includes more than 120 chapters nationally here in the United States. With that, let me introduce my co-host. Mariam Durrani is a professorial lecturer at the School of International Service and a faculty affiliate with the Anti-Racism Research and Policy Center at the American University here in Washington, D.C. As a decolonial feminist anthropologist, her scholarship seeks to shift how academia, media, and public discourse reflect on and reckon with the racialized Muslim subject based on the intersection between global wars and higher education. She is currently working on a book focusing on the impact of the US led war on terror at universities in Lahore and New York City. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam, and thank you to everyone who is tuning in right now. It's my pleasure to be here today with our esteemed guests, and I have the honor to introduce our first speaker today, Shahrazad Odeh. Shahrazad Odeh is a Palestinian human rights lawyer, researcher, and a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. Her work focuses on gender ramifications in legal systems, demilitarization, and the eradication of gun violence. She recently authored a fantastic piece, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend everyone to read it, titled The Orchestrated Persecution of Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian in 972 magazine. So please, Shahrazad, I invite you to start us off with the discussion of her case.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much, Bassam and Mariam, for the invite. Um, I think if we want to talk about the case of Nadira, we need to first acknowledge that by addressing the case of Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, we shed the light on the disturbing case that exposes the institutionalized racism and supremacy within the Zionist academic system. It highlights the suppression of academic freedom within these universities. If we want to just have a brief explanation of what happened to Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, who is a renewed Palestinian scholar and a vocal critic of Zionism. She is a mother for many scholarships, including um, the terminologies of unchilding. She wrote many scholarships that influenced each and every person that I imagine sits here today, and beyond. So, just a brief explanation of what happened. On April 18th, Israeli police arrested Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, a faculty member at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, from her home in East Jerusalem. Her arrest was very much an act of intimidation, and for her outspoken advocacy of Palestinian rights and criticism of Zionist ideology. During her arrest, police officers raided her home without warning, confiscating her books, papers, research materials. She was subjected to cruel and dehumanizing treatment, which amount to forms of torture. She was shackled. We're talking about a 64-year-old woman. She was shackled and put in a cell that was cold and very much stinky. She was also used, her health condition was used as leverage against her during the time of arrest and interrogation. So these conditions were set in order to break her spirit, much like any other Palestinian who is put under custody in these circumstances and these arrests. The prosecution of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian is a violation of academic freedom and a clear example of the institutionalized racism and supremacy that exist within the Israeli universities. These institutions that claims to be a home for equality and equity and intellectual discourse, but in reality they don't tolerate the perception that there could be any academic thought beyond Zionist knowledge and production of knowledge. This is basically when we talk about the case of Nadera, the arrest did not come as just just like that, didn't come from a vacuum. Nadera's arrest came after a vicious campaign and harassment against her by multiple sectors of Israeli society, leading the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, uh, her academic home, where she studied and she teaches for several years now. The Hebrew University in October issued a letter demanding that the professor resign from the institution for signing a statement demanding a ceasefire and calling the Gaza war a genocide. In March, the university suspended her in light of the Maqdisi Street podcast, in which she called the abolition of Zionism. She also was after discussing her case, she was reinstated in the institute, but still the calls that she is resigned or that she is suspended still out there in the universities. You can see it publicly in the universities in the universities platform, social media platform. So, as a result of this vicious campaign against Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian for her scholarship and for her knowledge production, sorry, I'm a bit sick. So the Hebrew University basically led an orchestrated campaign that is really set to break any kind of aspiration for Palestinians to be part of the Israeli academia or to have a say that is beyond the Zionist knowledge production. So as a result of the vicious campaign of the Hebrew University, the Israeli authorities also detained and questioned Professor Kevorkian in the Ben Gurion airport late March upon her return from an overseas speaking tour. Um, and and later, after that arrest or that detention, the prosecutor's office also recommended her interrogation, and which led to her arrest in October 18, in April 18th, and then the continuation of her interrogation since then. So, but meanwhile, many Israeli academics have been hosted on Israeli news channels and other media platforms since the war, actually, often really having a lot of violent, racist, and genocidal rhetorics against Palestinians. And we don't see any repercussions for these kind of actions or these kind of statements. This also comes in the context of, since the 7th of October, we see how the academic institutions have made it a priority to serve the country and to serve the country's war effort. They have suspended classes, encouraged fashion schools even to utilize their students to design and produce clothes that has special pockets for to carry weapons for Israeli security personnel. Some faculties also published posts on social media to recruit students for the country's hasbara or propaganda mission, and others to spy and report problematic statements and behaviors by their fellow students, Palestinian students. This It's important to address that all comes while having many students carrying Israeli students roaming the schools with massive guns, automatic rifles, automatic machine guns, intimidating basically Palestinians while saying that they are there to protect the school or themselves. So it's never it is never without the context. Nadira was suspended from school while having these people roaming the school with guns. And while many Palestinian students have been, as a result of their expression on social media, or even simply wearing a shirt with a Palestinian flag or with a watermelon, have been either have either been subjected to harassment by their students, by their fellow students, or even expelled by their professors and by the academic institution that they are in. Hundreds of Palestinian students were arrested, and non-students as well, were arrested because of what they said on social media, because of their because they dare to express themselves even for mundane things like victory shakshuka or a Quranic phrase. They were villainized, they were criminalized, and we see that they haven't stopped producing this kind of ideology, that anything that does not coincide with the Zionist ideology is punishable. So everything that denies the supremacy, that denies the let's say purity of the Zionist regime, especially today, is punishable. So the orchestrated prosecution of Nadira Shalhub-Kevorkian is a stark reminder that the Israeli universities are not truly inclusive or committed to academic freedom. They are institutions that uphold and prosecute the Zionist ideology, perpetuate the Zionist ideology, suppressing any voices or narratives that challenge the status quo. And I think maybe I will stop here, but I'm happy to talk more if you like.
Thank you, Shahrazad. I just want to share that it seems like, uh, based on some news reports, Hamas has accepted the Egyptian Qatari ceasefire proposal, which would uh, halt a total decimation of Rafah.
Wow.
Not Anyway, I just wanted to share this because so many of us today around the globe, I'm assuming, and certainly in Palestine and Gaza in particular, and in Rafah specifically, were holding their breath.
Yeah, I think today, to be honest, Bassam, there was something remarkable that I saw on Instagram today. It was a guy who that is situated in Rafah, who defended his master's thesis in the tent, and this made me think of the situation of Palestinians, whether scholars, teachers, and students who are facing this threat of not being able to really fulfill their future in the academia, whether situated in Israel or in Palestine, in the US and the UK. This idea that the thought is constantly at a threat. This idea is that the Palestinian mind is targeted regardless of where they are, regardless of the status they hold, right? Because Nadira is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and according to the law, she should be supported and she should not be indicted or incriminated or put under investigation for her academic work. But the university, really, we can see how they played a part in really vilifying Nadira for her work, because she produced such a powerful knowledge that basically criticize them. So I just want to make just this kind of connection between what's happening in the destruction of the Palestinian thought, the Palestinian scholarly, the Palestinian university, but also any other call that is against Zionism today. And I think this is my point of let's say this is my point of reference when we're talking about Nadira in particular, even if we don't want to talk about her Palestinian identity. If we want to link her knowledge production or her vilifying to the fact that Palestinian citizens of Israel as well, either university students or even lawyers, were vilified for supporting Gaza, for supporting for supporting an equal call for a freedom of speech or freedom or academic freedom.
Thank you. Thank you for this note, Shahrazad. Um, I'm not sure how to respond to this news, not because it's not good, but it's really awful that this is considered good news, but it is good news. Um, all right. So we will now move to Maya Wind, who is our author today, as well as someone who addresses the particulars of the background to this case. Maya Wind is a Killam postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia, where she researches the reproduction and international export of Israeli security expertise. Her first book, Towers of Ivory and Steel: How Israeli Universities Deny Palestinian Freedom, explores the complicity of Israeli universities in settler colonialism and apartheid. Ahlan wa sahlan, Maya. We are very glad to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bassam. And Mariam and Sara and Shahrazad. So it's really such an honor to share space with you, and a lot to take in at this moment. But thank you, Shahrazad, so much for laying it all out, for offering this critical context. I think within which we can really make sense of the targeting of Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. As you said, Shahrazad, she has been a mentor to so many of us, and she has been an inspiration to really countless young scholars who are seeking to study, to make sense of, to challenge colonial domination, not just in Palestine, I think, but really across the world. And I think, Shahrazad, as you so clearly laid out, this escalation against Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian is really years in the making. And what I want to offer, just for the purpose of our conversation today, is to kind of further reflect on the ways that I think that to really fully understand the violent campaign of repression against Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian, we really need to attend not only to the broader context of what Karma Nabulsi and other Palestinian scholars have long called scholasticide, right? So Israel's intentional and long-standing war on Palestinian education, but also what the Palestinian Feminist Collective has recently explained as sophicide, Israel's intentional annihilation of indigenous Palestinian knowledge traditions. But in addition, I think we have to locate this suppression of Nadira's research of Hebrew University and Israel's colonial systems of violence and genocide that she has been critically analyzing and speaking out against for many years now. I think, as with all settler states, I think it's really important to remember that genocide is structural to the Zionist project. Israel has always sought to eliminate the Palestinian people, to replace them with Jewish Israelis. And Hebrew University, the first and primary university of the Zionist movement, has been a pillar of and demographic engineering. And I think when we think about Hebrew University, it's important to begin with the lands on which it was built, right? So it was built in 1918 at the strategic apex of Mount Scopus, overlooking the Palestinian villages below, a campus that was designed to stake symbolic and political claim over the entire city of Jerusalem for the Zionist movement, which has been doing this for over a century now. So in the lead up to the 1948 war, Hebrew University played a pivotal role as well. It was one of the bases of the activities of the Haganah Militia's Science Corps, through which faculty and students themselves participated in the development and manufacturing of weapons to explicitly aid in Palestinian expulsion in the Nakba. A Hebrew University doctoral student himself in microbiology initiated and headed the Science Corps first biological department, which prepared typhoid dysentery, used as a biological weapon to poison Palestinian drinking water, again, to facilitate their dispossession in the spring of 1948. So this is really the history and the foundations of the Hebrew University. And in 1967, just one day after Israel occupied East Jerusalem, the university's Rehabilitation Planning Committee worked with the Israeli government to plan the seizure of lands from the neighboring Palestinian community of Isawiya, not only to expand the campus, but to aid in the state program of Judaization, what Israel calls Judaization, and the illegal annexation of occupied East Jerusalem. Rebuilding the Mount Scopus campus in the wake of the 1967 occupation not only naturalized the development of new Jewish settlements on expropriated Palestinian lands, which linked the university to West Jerusalem city center, the post-67 campus itself was explicitly designed as a massive militarized fortress surrounded by these tall walls, physically dominating the city skyline and symbolizing Israeli hegemony and control over the entire city of Jerusalem. But Hebrew University Mount Scopus, where Professor Shalhoub-Kevorkian teaches, is not only itself occupying Palestinian lands, it is actively and structurally serving as a pillar of the illegal Israeli domination of the Palestinian communities in occupied East Jerusalem. It runs tailored degree programs to train soldiers to hone their capacities to surveil and subdue Palestinians, including through offering regional and linguistic training to soldiers in the intelligence corps, particularly the new program, relatively new program as of 2019 in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic History at Hebrew U. And it offers its faculties and facilities and campus as sites for the production of legal expertise required to sustain Israeli apartheid, for the development of weapons and technologies deployed against Palestinians, again, using occupied East Jerusalem as its laboratory. And Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian has been conducting critical research about Israeli colonial violence for decades. Through deep ethnographic research, she writes about the lives of families, women, and children under occupation, the ways that the Israeli military, police, settler violence shapes their everyday lives. And as a feminist scholar, she has been making the invisible, particularly experiences are overwhelmingly invisible to the international community after decades of dehumanization, particularly in the West. And Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian writes about how the Israeli state and weapons corporations use these forms of governance and use the occupied Palestinian territory as a testing ground to refine technologies and then sell them abroad as battle proven. And so for this, precisely for this, as Shahrazad so clearly laid out, for this courageous and uncompromising research, she has for decades been discredited and harassed by Hebrew University, by her students, colleagues, the administration itself. And of course, this escalated last month with her suspension that paved the way for her arrest. And it is important to remember, it is only due to international pressure and calls to boycott Hebrew University that the administration called on the police to release her. But at the same time, they also went on record across the Israeli media to continue to delegitimize her scholarship and said that they strongly condemn the conclusions and arguments in her research. The faculty and of the Institute of Criminology, specifically, which is one of the departments at which Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian teaches, has particularly come out against her research. They accused her, and I'm quoting here, of blurring the lines between politics and scientific facts. And this from the same department that conducts research using classified data collected from Palestinians by the Israeli police and Shin Bet through illegal interrogation methods and torture, the same department that for years has been training the leadership of the Israeli police forces who sustain apartheid through a tailored degree program, and the same department that has established ties with the Israeli police to offer university-based research and policy recommendations. Simon Perry, in particular, a celebrated criminologist at the Institute of Criminology, spoke out against her in the Israeli media, accusing her of falsely accusing Israel of conducting experiments on Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And this is particularly curious, I think, because Israeli criminologists have openly and long declared themselves and understood themselves not only as a research and training arm of Israeli police apparatuses, but as pioneers in what they consider and they call an international field of counter-terror policing. So this, Simon Perry in particular himself, he put it in one of his articles, Israel has the potential to serve as a fascinating research laboratory for studying policing. This is a quote from Perry. So Israel's leading criminologists promote their studies as useful to law enforcement and intelligence and security agencies worldwide, and they themselves advocate the exports of Israeli tactics, which have been widely condemned for violating Palestinian human rights. And in showcasing the models of Israeli so-called counter-terror policing, these same faculty who are speaking out against Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian have brought delegates themselves, academics and others, to observe the checkpoints and comprehensive surveillance systems in occupied East Jerusalem. To say nothing of the fact Israeli military industries themselves, which were birthed by and have been embedded in Hebrew University and across the Israeli universities from their foundation and continue to be sustained by them, openly themselves advertise their weapons and technologies as battle-proven. But when Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, a Palestinian scholar, takes these well-known facts as a starting point for what she calls decolonial scholarship, when she highlights the devastating costs of these Israeli forms of experimentation to Palestinian men, women, and children, she is accused by her colleagues, her university administration, and the government of incitement against the Israeli state. And I think this is no coincidence because of the power of the indictment of her research. She has shown how the Israeli state for decades engages Palestinian children as combatants, a practice that she has called unchilding, which we are seeing now has reached unfathomable new heights over the last 7 months in Gaza, with over 13,000 children killed, thousands more maimed, thousands more orphaned, and subjected to malnutrition by Israel. So it should not surprise any of us, I think, that Hebrew University is so forcefully disavowing her research. Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian is exposing the crimes of the Israeli state that the university itself is complicit in. And precisely because of this deep complicity, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel over 2 decades ago called on the international community, and particularly the international academic community, to boycott the Israeli academy that serves as a pillar of the oppressive order against Palestinians. This is how they called it, over 2 decades ago. And I think that all of us in the international community must urgently heed this call. And it is a devastating truth to live with that we do not know what the last 7 months would have looked like had we heeded it when it was first issued 2 decades ago. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, thank you so much to both Shahrazad and Maya for laying out how the university becomes a site for settler colonial violence in the case of Israel, in all the ways, all the different formations that kind of are mechanized to kind of further this and to delegitimize the important scholarship of Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. So I'd like to now invite Sara Ihmoud to speak. Sara Ihmoud is a Chicana Palestinian anthropologist who works to uplift the lived experiences, histories, and political contributions of Palestinian women and Palestinian feminism. She is a founding member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, an executive board member of Insaniyat, the Society of Palestinian Anthropologists, and she is also an assistant professor of anthropology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us, and I'm excited to hear your comments.
Thank you, Mariam and Bassam, for hosting this conversation. And to my colleagues, Maya and Shahrazad, it's been a privilege to learn from you both. And I think you've both made the stakes very plain and outlined the broader contributions that have shaped the intellectual trajectory of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian throughout her career, and which form the foundations of why she's being targeted in this moment in such a violent way. So I won't sort of review the accolades of her feminist scholarship and the contributions that she's made to our community. I think you've done that clearly already. But I do want to uplift a little bit more around why Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian's work has been instrumental to our feminist envisioning. Her work has been an inspiration as it has provided us with a framework for teaching life in the context of the ongoing catastrophe in Gaza, what she terms overkillability as genocide. And I'm reading largely from a statement that a collective of feminists, of Palestinian feminists in particular, have authored that really outlines the case of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, and which calls on feminist scholars and activists everywhere to continue advocating for the charges against her to be dropped, which will be released in the near future. Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian teaches her students and emerging social workers, future psychologists, feminists, and legal scholars at the Hebrew University and beyond how to contribute to the transformation of trauma and collective grief by ways of informed intersections of knowledge and love for children and family life, for collectivity, for connectivity and livability, cutting across boundaries and groups, inspiring her students and colleagues to dare to know deeply and differently all those impacted by violence, always approaching devastating loss with love, with collective care and devotion to humanity. And this is precisely why, as my colleagues have already outlined, she's being targeted and criminalized, and why her scholarship is being criminalized and the Zionist state is attempting to discredit her. Because her work provides us with a framework for social responsibility amidst a genocide, a framework for collectively envisioning our freedom and love at a time when it is needed most. So we as Palestinian feminists understand that the attack on Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian is an attack on all of us. The recent attacks on Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian have attempted to criminalize her, not only for her critique of Israeli genocide, but also for her identity as a Palestinian and her leadership among a community of Palestinian scholars that resist settler colonial violence and oppression. Research is always political, as it becomes a space of holding on to memory, continuing the Palestinian story, and affirming Palestinian life and futurity, defying the logics of erasure which the settler state thrusts upon us as Palestinians. And Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian is a living archive who evades settler colonial domination and control. So she, as many of you have already stated, she, for several decades, has worked at the grassroots level, doing community-based research with primarily Palestinian families, children, mothers, those who are really on the front lines of resisting settler colonial violence and oppression, in particular in occupied East Jerusalem, but across the geographies of Palestine. And so she holds their stories. She helps us to understand the context of the stories that people tell. And she helps to narrate the Palestinian story as a practice of affirming Palestinian life and futurity. So in this way, the targeting and arrest of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian from her home in the Old City of Jerusalem while she was in bed to silence her and incarcerate her body are clear and obvious strategies to deter others, to delegitimize Palestinian scholarship and existence, and to attack our living archive, to attack our collective memory and our embodied homeland. The research methods that Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian uses are themselves modes of anti-colonial resistance that have a long tradition in indigenous studies, in critical race theory, and in Palestinian feminist studies. As an anti-colonial feminist scholar who is a deeply valued member of our global community, Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian builds her analysis from the ground up with communities who are surviving and persisting against everyday forms of violence. In doing so, her research is an act of community building by elevating the voices of those most marginalized, invisibilized, criminalized, and silenced. In her research and scholarship, Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian refuses to be entrapped by methods and analyses that uphold colonial narratives and disguise themselves as decontextualized objective truth. Instead, she anchors her work by listening rigorously and relationally to children and families most impacted by the very social problems she is committed to addressing and undoing. So as we condemn the ongoing attacks on Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, we are acutely aware of the ongoing genocidal assault on our siblings in Gaza. The state wants our collective mobilization and love to be dismembered. The state wants to distract us from the ongoing atrocities in Gaza by focusing on individual Palestinians, like the case of Professor Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian. But even as her research is targeted, the attacks on Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian sprout from her unapologetic centering of Gaza, the genocide, the erasure, and the gendered state violence propelling further settler colonial violence forward. The targeted attacks on her as a scholar are part of the deliberate annihilation of Palestinian knowledge traditions inspired by the land itself, as well as the carriers of that knowledge, which stretch across the fragmented geographies of the Palestinian cultural body, or Sophicide. And Sophicide, as we define it through the Palestinian Feminist Collective, also includes scholasticide, a Palestinian concept that refers to the physical destruction of centers of knowledge, educational resources, infrastructures, and archives, as well as the silencing, censorship, and repression of history, epistemology, scholarship, and subjectivity. Evidence of the intentional obliteration of Palestinian knowledge and knowledge production rests in the Zionist IOF's complete destruction of all 12 universities in Gaza, in addition to the destruction of over 378 schools, public libraries, laboratories, classrooms, research facilities, and cultural institutions, depriving Palestinians of the histories and knowledges housed in these institutions. So understanding this form of genocide as sophicide elucidates how schools, universities, and spaces of learning are not just physical structures, they are the fabric of life. These were places realizing the aspirations of Palestinian youth who had been under siege in Gaza their entire lives. And so we understand the attacks on Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian and her research are deeply intertwined with the attacks on Palestinian educational institutions, the attacks on scholars and students across the geographies of Palestine that settler colonialism attempts to fragment and dismember. Seeking to incarcerate Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian and to delegitimize her scholarship is an attempt to further silence and separate our indigenous sources of love and knowledge rooted in our lands, our intimacies, togetherness, and histories. And so to speak out against her repression and to demand that she is protected and cared for is also an enactment of this indigenous refusal rooted in love. And I'll end there, again, highlighting that what I'm reading from today is a feminist statement advocating for the immediate protection of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian that will be released by a group of feminist scholars in the coming.
Mariam, do you want to lead, or do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd like to start, but I just wanted to first just thank you all for teaching us and helping us understand the specific case and the structural contextual dynamics that are shaping what's happening, and also kind of setting the stakes very clearly. And so I think along those lines, I wanted to turn first to Shahrazad and ask for you to speak a little bit more about how the university becomes a site of exclusion, specifically for Palestinian students, and how the university uses the language of creating kind of like a pluralistic environment to obscure some of the ways that Palestinian students and faculty are targeted. And I also really wanted to appreciate the statement about how the Palestinian mind is targeted wherever. So we are seeing, of course, this is happening in many different contexts, but focusing on how it's showing up in the.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for the question, and thanks for the very insightful talks by my colleagues. I think when we're talking about when we want to talk about the limitations that the universities put, I think it's important first to recognize the disadvantage points that the Palestinian students in Israel face coming to the academy in the beginning. I mean, the education systems and the education system in the school, in the Palestinian schools inside of Israel, as citizens of the state, is controlled by the state. Purposefully is built in order to very much narrow the Palestinian students' aspiration. The schools become like a factory for points, and instead of like real education, the like the all I'll use again the word orchestrated, but it is like an orchestrated education system that is set to send the clear reminder for Palestinians that they are limited. I grew up in a place that I had the privilege to study in a private school. But the private school also had a lot of limitations, right? We weren't studied the same the level of Hebrew used in the in our school was much higher than the level of Arabic that we studied. So it is there to remind us that we are also not able to connect to our identity as Palestinians. It is also a place, the schools, the Palestinian schools in Israel, is set to just prevent the Palestinians from creating any kind of identity, a collective Palestinian identity, because any formation of or any try to any attempt to like create a certain identity, a collective identity, is punished, because the schools are surveilled, because the system is the system is also surveilled. So there is also the idea of what you want to study in the future is very limited, because even if you want to be to be a pilot. You can't, right? Because you need to be enrolled in the Air Force. You can't do many things as a Palestinian. Up until 10 years ago, Palestinians who would study in higher education, such as the Technion Institute, the Technological Institute, would finish their degree and be a teacher in high school. So the idea of like, yeah, in the recent years there has been an opening for including more, or like inclusion of more Palestinians in the school system, or sorry, in higher education system, in the workforce, but it's still very limited. So Palestinians enter the school in a disadvantage point. Coming to a school, I mean, like university, coming to a university where you are, when you know that you are limited, and then seeing all these, for example, statements that are either by either a professor or by your colleague in school, that vilifies you, or that discriminate against you, and you would have no place to go to, is also very much restricting, because you don't know where to go, right? So for example, um, let's say today we can see, we see how Palestinians really have no place to go to. Even institutions that also in the past 10 years, as I said, like they have bettered the services for Palestinian students inside of the academic institutions, like establishing an equity and diversity and community commissions, whether in different institutions and in different academic institutions. But but since the 7th of October in particular, these institutes, um, or these commissions, issued letters for suspensions for students who dare to speak out on social media. They were also taking an active part in suspending students. So even when the university tried to be inclusive, there is constantly a limitation for Palestinians to be included, to be a part of the academia. So, and I think the case of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian really exemplifies it, because um, I want to point out to another professor that in the Israeli academia, that was a bit problematic, to say the least. Since the start of the October 7th, he really publicly stated, he had a lot of genocidal statement on across social media platform, or across different media platforms. His name is Dr. Mordechai Kedar, a professor in Bar Ilan University. The same professor had a statement in 2014, so 10 years ago, during the war in Gaza, then encouraging the use of Palestinian women's body and sexuality as weapon of war. On a radio show, he said the only thing that can deter terrorists like those who kidnap the children and kill them is the knowledge that their sister or their mother will be raped. So that thing happened 10 years ago. 10 years ago, maybe we did not have a place to go to. But if we have already an institution that is there to help us feel safe in the Israeli academia, and this institution, instead of like deterring this professor from speaking out and calling having these kind of genocidal, using this genocidal rhetorics, is doing the opposite, is actually suspending Palestinians. You can see the irony that is there. You can see the irony and how these institutions that even that were established to protect the Palestinians are there to deter them. Um,
Thank
hope I
you.
answered.
Absolutely, thank you, and thanks also to Sarah. I just realized that when you finished, Sarah, I did not express how wonderful your comments were. And this, of course, applies to everybody. I'm going to go to Maya. Um, Maya, you described in your work the long-standing institutional complicity of Hebrew universities, specifically, and Israeli universities generally, in Israeli settler colonialism, and what Palestinian scholars, students, and activists have called on academics in the international community to do to address it. You also highlighted that Israeli universities are complicit in this genocide. Can you speak more about this and share with us why the call for academic boycott is particularly urgent at this time, given there's some resistance even within the, the camp that is critical of Israel's policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the question, and has been the question for some time, for those of us in, particularly in the Western academic community, that so directly sustains and enables and legitimizes the Israeli Academy, which again is a pillar of Israeli racial rule. So I think, sort of building on Shahrazad's important comments about structure, I think I can say another word about that, which is, again, what PACB's analysis offers us and has offered us for 2 decades now is an analysis of structure and of the institutional ties of Israeli universities to the project of settler colonialism, to the regime of apartheid. But I think it is important, particularly, to attend to the ways that these institutions are now actively complicit in genocide. So it is no coincidence, as Shahrazad pointed out, that they are so viciously policing Palestinian expression, particularly on their own campuses. There's a lot at stake, and they themselves are so deeply implicated in this genocide over the last 7 months. So Hebrew University and every Israeli university has enlisted their institutes and even their courses to produce hasbara, right? So Israeli state propaganda to counter, particularly mobilization against Israel and critique of Israeli genocide. And we're seeing this now also with the total panic of Israeli universities at witnessing the student intifada across the world, and students rising up courageously to speak out against this genocide and to put everything on the line for Palestinian liberation. So you're seeing it there too. Um, their faculties of law have been working overtime to counter attempts to hold the Israeli state, the Israeli military accountable. We saw this very clearly in the response to the case brought by South Africa to the ICJ. And we're seeing that the universities continue to produce and work and cooperate with weapons corporations, their longstanding ties, these same military industries that they themselves birthed. They're continuing to offer their campuses as laboratories for the development of weapons used against Palestinians by the same companies that have tried new technologies, new drones, and other weapons on Palestinians in this genocide and have already put them on display for international export. And we're seeing them continue to train Israeli soldiers. Hebrew University has been training Israeli soldiers that go on to serve in Unit 8200 and others to create mass target banks in Gaza. And they're even granting course credit to reserve soldiers coming back from Gaza to their classrooms. So the complicity of Israeli universities is not only decades long, but it is very direct in this particular genocide. They are so deeply implicated. And so it is no surprise to us that they are so fiercely opposing mobilization, not only within their campuses by very courageous, particularly Palestinian students, as well as by the principled and courageous students across the world who are putting up encampments now to protest the genocide and in support of Palestinian liberation. And so I think it has never been more urgent for all of us, particularly in the international academic community and in Western institutions that continue to fund and send students over for study abroad programs and collaborate in all sorts of joint research ventures with Israeli universities. The time is now to enact the academic boycott. It is the very least that we can do is to end the complicity in genocide, our own complicity in genocide.
Thank you so much, Maya. I really appreciate the connections that you're making in terms of how the call for the boycott, for the academic boycott, has been going on for more than 2 decades. And in in many ways, the student encampment, the student demands are consistently to have their universities divest, and to address all of these kind of structural ways of legitimizing relationships between their university and universities in Israel. So I really appreciate that point. Um, I want to now turn to Sara and ask you to speak more about the particular kind of gender dynamics of the political repression as it's appearing within the university context and beyond, and how we should kind of, again, from a feminist analysis, kind of like see the ways that individuals are being identified based on their particular precarities and vulnerabilities, and that is part of the design of.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for this question. I mean, I think, as my colleagues have shared, and as is widely known, Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian's research has been absolutely essential to our understanding of the gender and sexual politics of Zionism. And Zionism as a genocidal project, Zionist colonialism in Palestine, has always been deeply intertwined with various gender and sexual dynamics. And so we have to understand the gender dynamics of political repression unfolding today as being directly connected to these broader gender dynamics of war and genocide, both historically and in the contemporary moment in Gaza and across Palestine. And, it's important to say that war is always about a performance of hypermasculinity. As many feminist scholars have taught us, and sexual atrocity transforms women's bodies into a method of communication between men. And in our own history, gender and sexual politics have played a central role in Israel's genocidal violence since its inception. Rape was used as part of an attempt to terrify Palestinian communities into fleeing their ancestral homes and villages in 1948. And these politics continue today in Gaza, right, where we've seen UN reports of not only sexual violence, but also gender and sexual humiliation of both Palestinian women and men on a mass scale. And so Indigenous women's bodies and sexualities are targeted because of what they represent: land, Indigenous reproduction, sovereignty, and the possibility of Indigenous futures. And this is, of course, intertwined with the targeting of women's bodies because of the educational archives, the historical archives, the memory that they hold. So while rape or sexual violence might be inflicted on the bodies of women, in particular during wartime context, its broader purpose is often to humiliate and punish the collective to which they belong. The gendered logics of the militarized performance that is unfolding in Gaza today is precisely to force us through mass violence and psychological terror to recognize and accept our defeat. And I think part of why I'm sharing all of this sort of background and history is, again, to bring into focus the targeting of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian and the targeting of Palestinian women, gender nonconforming, and queer folks more broadly in relation to these broader gender and sexual dynamics of the settler colonial project. Palestinian feminists have been working to call attention to these gendered logics that animate Israeli settler colonialism for decades, and yet they have been met with little political interest by feminists in the West, right? Instead, we as Palestinian women and feminists are consistently asked to participate in our own pathologization and criminalization by colonial powers. Shahrazad just mentioned the comments of Mordechai Kedar during the 2014 military invasion of Gaza and the occupied territories. And I remember that moment clearly because it was a clear articulation of the sexual dynamics of Israel's genocidal logics being brought into the public. And that is still very much the gender and sexual logic that we're contending with, right? And Palestinian women and feminists are asked to reproduce the culturalized narratives such as this that contribute to this protracted violence directed at our communities, right? That has always been the logic, that rape and sexual violence are necessary because of the ways that our communities have been pathologized, right? And as an internalization of our oppressor's own fear. So in the contemporary moment, these politics have played out in the demands that Palestinian feminists and our allies condemn the sensationalized accounts of mass rape on October 7th, to which as of yet no actual evidence exists. And so in this logic of Zionist colonialism, a refusal to admit that mass rape occurred on October 7th becomes a form of further incrimination, even as the Zionist state is actively raping and pillaging our bodies and our lands in this moment, right? And so I'm drawing attention to that because this is the initial context in which Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian was targeted and criminalized and eventually suspended by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It was the supposed comments that she made around these accusations of mass rape on October 7th that were the cause, according to the leadership of the Hebrew University, for her dismissal. And of course, this was a gross mischaracterization of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian's actual words. It was an attempt to discursively constrain her attention to the criminality of the Israeli state in a moment of intensified genocidal war, while it was also an attempt to mark her as a proponent of violence, which is a mode of colonial gaslighting, right? And as Maya so eloquently described, it also has to be understood as part of a growing wave of disciplinary action targeting Palestinian scholars within Israeli academia. So while the Hebrew University eventually announced it had reversed its dismissal of Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian on March 27th after a meeting in which, according to the administration, she clarified that she was not dismissing the possibility that cases of rape occurred on October 7th, it's important to really think with these dynamics because they teach us about these broader gendered and sexual logics of colonial power, about the desires of the Zionist movement to discipline and criminalize and terrorize Palestinian women and feminists, including our scholars and activists, including our movement leaders, from naming and exposing the gender violence that sits at the very core of the colonial project and which we are witnessing on a mass scale today. And so these dynamics must be recognized and named for what they are, right? These repressive dynamics, the repression in particular of Palestinian women and feminist scholars who are naming and calling attention to the pervasive gender and sexual abuses against Palestinians writ large, are recycling and retrenchment of the very gendered logics of Israel's genocidal politics in another form. And as I've written previously, many of us have faced Israel's violent attempts to silence our voices, and in doing so, discipline us into erasure with punitive ramifications politically, professionally, and personally when writing or speaking out about the injustices facing our people, including histories of gender and sexual violence that continue into the present. In fact, the gendered and sexualized backlash that we face as Palestinian women and feminists when writing or speaking out about ongoing histories of gender and sexual violence highlights the fact that this backlash is in fact an extension of colonial politics. Indeed, the same rhetoric targeting Palestinian women's bodies and sexualities are remade in a new context. These gendered forms of violence not only endanger the lives and agency of Palestinian women and feminists, they also impede the critical debate, analysis, and heterogeneity within our own communities that are always necessary to grow and sustain liberatory movement building. So as feminists, we know that rape and sexual violence are endemic to armed conflict, and we condemn gender violence in our own communities as essential to our own liberation as a people. And this has been a cornerstone of feminist movement building in our communities, both in Palestine and across diasporic spaces for generations. Still, we recognize the cruel irony that the very language and discourse of feminism is being used and resurfacing in this moment to justify our own elimination as a people by the very powers decreeing gendered violence, right? So again, we know that the targeting of feminist scholars such as Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian and those who are speaking out as feminists in this moment about the gender and sexual dynamics of Zionist colonialism, of genocide in Gaza, is an attempt to break our spirits. It's an attempt to make us too afraid to continue speaking and writing and acting defiantly as Palestinian women and feminists for our people's freedom. This is a further attempt to demonize us, to monsterize and pathologize our Palestinian men, to break apart our sacred kinships with each other in our homeland, to invade our intimacies, to assault the senses and orchestrate affects of widespread fear, terror, and defeat, to undermine the power and authority of our truths, to belittle the beauty of our voices, and to break the role that we must continue to take up in this moment as feminists, right? It is imperative as feminists that we speak out, that we act, that we do everything in our power in whatever spaces we are a part of to interrupt this genocidal war as it continues to unfold. So this disciplinary violence is precisely a key element of what Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian has theorized herself as the, quote, cunning of gender violence, right? Where ironically, the very rhetoric and recognition of gendered violence exercised by authority figures in the global governance community, right? Western nations and their allies can too often hide or lead the gendered violence and criminality of powerful state actors, hiding it in plain sight. So the repression of Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian and other feminist scholars and activists who are speaking out against genocide in this moment is both a message and a test case, right? The Zionist project's instrumentalization of rape claims to inflict more violence on Palestinian women and feminists speaking out against mass atrocity is meant to terrify and disempower us, to discipline us into silence at any time and complicity, and to show us that if they can do it to Nadera, they can do it to any one of us at any time. And these are precisely the abusive gendered tactics that are so central to weaponizing rape and sexual violence during intensified military conflict and the genocidal policies the Israeli state carries out in Gaza today. So if we are serious about ending sexual violence and genocide and armed conflict, then we have to take the well-documented claims of sexual violence against Palestinian women, men, and children that Palestinian feminists have been speaking out against since 1948, and rejecting the violent reproduction of the cunning of gender violence is a feminist responsibility in this moment that allows us to name the gendered logics of settler colonial genocide while honoring the living embodied memories of those who continue to survive.
Thank you so much, Sara, for laying out so clearly how gender and sexual logics are undergirding these violences, specifically settler colonial violence and genocidal violence as we're seeing at the moment. I wanted to actually now turn to Shahrazad to speak a little bit more on the case specifically of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, and to speak to the political legal context as it's shaping this case at the moment, and what that tells us.
Thank you, Mariam. I think when we approach the subject of Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, and as I said before, we cannot look at it without looking at the mass arrests campaign that happened since 7th of October for anyone who tried to speak out, as Sarah said it so perfectly. If they can do it with Nadira, then they can do it with anyone else. Then if someone such a um, who has such influence can be incriminated, can be villainized, can be arrested for her scholarship. And it's important to say that the interrogation so far against Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian, as we heard from her family and friends, solely focus on her scholarship. So if we look at it, we see that the attempt is to racially silence any attempt by Palestinians and by others who support her. And since the 7th of October, the universities across Israel have taken the responsibility in silencing any person who speaks out against the state, even those who, in the beginning of the war, in the beginning of the genocide, many university academics signed some letters in support of Palestinian students who were expelled from university and expelled from their studies, including in Haifa University. And the Haifa University has issued a letter claiming that for one of the prominent academics, asking them or encouraging them to resign because of their stand with the Palestinian students. So this is to say that the academia is, as Maya said, is an integral part of the Zionist institution. We cannot disconnect them, right? So politically, we can never disconnect the academia from the knowledge production, or from the legal production, or from the how Palestinians are treated inside the state. And since the 7th of October, Palestinians, even lawyers, were arrested. And as we see today, although many scholars, when they write about the legal system in Israel, they talk about two legal systems very much separated, as Noor Arakat beautifully says, justice for some, right? But when we talk about Palestine, when we talk about the case of Palestinians inside the legal system, we talk usually about the militarized rule for Palestinians, or so militarized a military court for Palestinians and civilian courts for Israelis. But it's not really the case. Palestinians, whether citizens of the state or residents of the state, have been a part of the of the legal system that is supposedly for the citizens, right? For the by like they abide by different rules than the ones who are under military occupation. But we have seen that there's a different strategy in talking about or dealing with these cases since the May uprising of 2021. Since the May uprising of May 2021, we have seen a shift in the political and legal discourse to further criminalize Palestinians for their attempt. So even those who were arrested for a small thing, such as a post on Instagram or Facebook or any kind of social media, before 2021, they were treated differently than what we are seeing today. And what the case today with Nadera, and the case today with the freedom of expression and the freedom of, when you are targeted for your knowledge production, basically states that you are dealt with not as citizen, but rather as a subject, right? You are treated as Palestinian. And this is the case basically when many students, Palestinian students in Palestinian, who are students from the occupied Palestinian territories, have been arrested since forever for their activism on campus. When many scholars have been arrested since the 7th of October, from the occupied territories, because of their knowledge production. Sara, you mentioned the documentation of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment and sexual violence during wartime against Palestinians. When Khalida Jarrar wrote a very important piece during the war about the sexual torture that women face in detention during this war, she was arrested. And Khalida Jarrar is also is arrested for her knowledge production. So what we see today is that there's a clear statement by the state that basically tells us Palestinian citizens that we no longer have the privilege to be treated as citizens. That today we do face this kind of like very much like binary legal system of a Palestinian versus an Israeli. Something that hasn't happened before, something that was again that started showing after the May uprising of 2021. So we see the dichotomy of ruling, of judgments. And if we even like if we look at rulings from the court of labor law, we see that even cases that were submitted against the supposedly illegal um, suspension of workers because of their social media or posts, the courts basically said that in the grand scheme of things, under the war, there has even if the employer did not work according to the law, it is still the decision is still binding because of the statements, because the statements were so delicate in the time of war. So we can see that this like again, if we as citizens had some kind of protection and privilege within the legal system, we'd see it like very much dismantling throughout the legal system, whether in labor law cases, whether in criminal cases. So I think what we see with Nadera is an example of how Palestinians are treated today. And we can see that the supposedly status that it was supposed to be protecting us is no longer existing.
Thank you, Shahrazad, and everyone else. We are hitting close to 90 minutes, so I have a quick question. Well, not so quick for Maya, and then Mariam will probably end with a question for Sarah. Um, Sorry, we're keeping you longer than we thought, but there's a lot going on, and a lot of people continue to join this feed. You guys must be saying something problematic. All right. Sarah, we are okay. So I'll say it very plainly. I've been wanting to interview you separately about the book. I mean, it's not Sarah, Maya. Did I say Sarah? Yeah, because I think I was sorry, Maya. I've been wanting to interview you for quite some time about this book, and of course, this is now.
We might have, sorry, Bassam.
Yeah, we lost Maya.
I think we might have lost her. Yeah.
Well, maybe I go back to Sarah. Okay, how about you go back to Sarah? Okay, there she is. Sorry, Maya, we lost you. Can you hear me? So I've been wanting to interview you about your book, and now this is the best time to address it. Can you share with us some of the insights from the book that connect to this conversation, especially those insights that you haven't addressed yet, because we've addressed, you've addressed and others have addressed some, but can you just tell us a little bit about the book and its connection to the current political context?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the framing of this project, or the reason I approached this project, was precisely to address a gap that I think has been laid bare to a new extent over the last several months of mobilizing on particularly North American European campuses, which is the wide gulf that exists and has long existed between what Palestinian scholars and students and civil society organizations have been saying about the Israeli Academy for over 2 decades, and the persistent, and Sara spoke to this so precisely, the persistent silencing and sidelining of Palestinian critique, of Palestinian scholarship, of Palestinian analysis, not only by PACB, but also by Palestinian thinkers and students across both Israeli universities and Palestinian universities in the diaspora for decades, which have really sought to highlight the ways in which Israeli universities and the Israeli academic system of higher education are so deeply embedded in Palestinian unfreedom. And so this gulf really is just so stark. So I think really I came to do this research in answer to the Palestinian civil society question about the complicity of Israeli universities. So I think what we're really seeing, and both this conversation and in other conversations you've hosted, I think that the links between the ways in which Israeli universities operate both as settler universities and then our own settler universities in the United States and Canada, imperial universities in Europe, the links between the violence that is sustained across these universities, and thinking about and understanding Israeli universities as a node in this broader imperial formation, I think has been laid bare in particular in the violent response to the student encampments and mobilizations across the West, of students rising up to meet the calls from Palestinian students and faculty too that have reiterated over the last 7 months the call for academic boycott, the call for divestment, the call to hold precisely the institutions that the Israeli institutions that are most directly sustaining Israeli violence and now genocidal violence accountable.
Yes, thank you so much, Maya. I think I'm really excited to read your book. So thank you so much for kind of laying out one of the ways that we can analyze the way the university is complicit in these forms of colonial and state violence. I also wanted to just appreciate all of you for really centering feminist scholarship and feminist analysis today, specifically, decolonial feminist analysis. And I also hope that everyone who is listening, one of the most important ways to support academics and scholars who are being targeted for their brilliant work, the way that Professor Shalhub-Kevorkian is to read their work. So I really hope that people are making that kind of note for themselves of the homework that they have after this panel. And so on that note, I wanted to turn to our last question for Sara to speak more about this, about how, what does it mean to incorporate a feminist praxis for how we approach our understanding of academic freedom, especially in this moment. And again, thank you to all of you for teaching us and for centering a feminist praxis.
Thank you, Miriam. I'll try to keep it brief. And of course, I couldn't stop myself from looking at the news as we're, anticipating news of the ceasefire. And it seems that Israel has rejected the potential proposal, as is expected. And I don't know. I mean, even if a ceasefire was reached now, the UN is estimating that it would take, a century to rebuild the Gaza Strip, which is beyond our lifetime, right? 3 generations of Palestinians trapped in this aftermath of genocide, even after reaching a ceasefire. So I think, it's important to center the annihilation of Palestinian intellectual and cultural institutions in relation to that broader, what will now be an intergenerational project of rebuilding Gaza once a ceasefire deal is reached. And I want to again draw on collective analysis that's already out in the public, and you can read this on Mondoweiss. According to the Palestinian Feminist Collective's analysis of soficide in Gaza and in their statement on a feminist praxis of academic freedom. We define soficide as the Zionist regime's deliberate annihilation of indigenous knowledge traditions inspired by the land itself, as well as the carriers of that knowledge, including elders and women. Soficide involves the crushing of Palestinian life and learning through the systematic murder of Palestinian students, mentors, teachers, researchers, scholars, academics, writers, librarians, archivists, spiritual leaders, and more. Such attacks on these indigenous knowledge carriers affect entire generations of learners, crushing their aspirations and dreams. And soficide also includes scholasticide, a Palestinian concept that refers to the physical destruction of centers of knowledge, educational resources, infrastructures, and archives, as well as the silencing, censorship, and repression of Palestinian history, memory, epistemology, scholarship, and subjectivity. The Zionist regime's academic repression has obviously extended beyond Palestine and into the US and Canadian settler education centers across Turtle Island, reflecting a systemic failure by university administrators and other authorities to protect students, to protect educators and staff in their communities in the pursuit of knowledge free from harm. So while existing frameworks for academic freedom on our campuses have actually enabled violence against Palestinians and our allies to occur with impunity, and we're still watching the violent destruction of peaceful protests that students across the country are waging in service of Palestinian liberation. So our feminist praxis for true academic freedom begins with the premise that all forms of genocide, including soficide and scholasticide, are antithetical to learning, teaching, well-being, and safety, that university administrators and authorities should be held accountable for their role in genocide and systemic oppression, and that feminism must center the ability to live and learn freely from our campuses on Turtle Island to Palestine. And again, I'm reading directly from the Palestinian Feminist Collective's analysis of soficide in a statement called A Feminist Praxis for Academic Freedom in the Context of Genocide in Gaza, which is available both on our website and was published recently on Mondoweiss. And I'll end with a quote from this statement. Quote, our feminist praxis for academic freedom foregrounds the idea that education is the practice of liberation and is anchored in rebellion as a communal process, holding the experiential truth of the multiple ways that women of color have been and continue to be silenced and devalued in the academy. We foreground radical care as an antidote to repressive, racist, discriminatory, and anti-intellectual measures. Our feminist praxis for academic freedom works against the weaponization of safety and other feminist and liberatory ideals on university campuses and beyond. We call out the Zionist, racist, and white supremacist weaponization of safety and fear as a guise for silencing, repressing, and erasing us. We know that, quote, when colonizers talk about security, they are in fact talking about violence, end quote. Coupled with the weaponization of anti-Semitism, this colonial Eurocentric concept of safety has been used to silence pro-Palestinian speech in the service of the comfort of Zionist students. This repression will not keep any of us safe. As a collective of anti-Zionist Jewish organizations has asserted, quote, investment in state violence is not indicative of care for Jewish lives, end quote. As feminists rooted in anti-colonial work, we know that we keep us safe against state violence, including policing and administrative tactics of repression. We affirm community accountability models of responding to state and intimate violences rooted in abolitionist movements led by Black, Indigenous, racialized, and oppressed peoples, end quote. And I'll end there again by saying that our students who are leading these campus-wide rebellions against genocide, against scholasticide, against soficide in Palestine, and from Palestine to Turtle Island are really leading the way in enacting a praxis of this feminist praxis for academic freedom in the context of genocide in Gaza. They have created alternative forms of relating to each other. They are already creating a new world in the way that they're practicing radical love and care for each other and abolition, in maintaining these encampments across our campuses, and our faculty who are standing up to protect them in this moment are also enacting this feminist praxis for academic freedom in the context of this ongoing genocide. So I and many other feminist scholars and activists continue to applaud their vision, their visionary leadership, because it is our students right now that are truly leading us into this new world.
Thank you so much, everyone. Sorry, my voice is not great today. I've been talking a lot. I need to shut up. I would like to sincerely thank all of you, not just for joining us, but for addressing very, very sensitive matters. Sarah, Maya, Shahrazad, and of course my wonderful co-host Mariam. Um, we are very glad that we have the opportunity to communicate with a much broader audience, and we will continue to do so. Let me just say a couple of things before we break. I will put on screen right now the various or the previous events that we have had. The Let me see, where is it? Okay, there we go. It basically uh,